From the author of Spinsterella, A Strange and Unusual Romance comes Spellbound, a darker shade of black. Get Spellbound this Halloween in paperback and ebook at online booksellers everywhere. In a previous video, I discussed how distribution and marketing were having an impact on the comic book industry, and I discussed how comic publishers not understanding how distribution and marketing worked were impeding their sales. Now, in this video, I'm going to talk about another aspect of the comic book industry that is impeding sales of the overall business, and that is the comic book store. Now, there are only two places where you can get comic books in America these days. One is your Barnes & Noble, the other is your comic book store. And both environments are not really constructive towards helping the comic book industry grow in terms of sales. Now, your Barnes & Noble primarily is a bookseller, and they focus on selling things like novels and literature. And their focus isn't on selling comic books. When it comes down to 32-page comic books, their all section is in the magazines, is part of the magazine section, and it's a small part of the magazine section. Now, they do have a graphic novel section, but graphic novels are considered a secondary business in publishing. When it comes down to publishing comic books, the sales are primarily meant to be sold through the 32-page books, whereas the trade paperback is meant to be extra revenue. This is considered gravy in the comic publishing business, that graphic novel section. That's supposed to be extra money that was supposed to be made after the initial publication. The money that was supposed to be made was supposed to be in the initial publication of those issues at the magazine side. Unfortunately, Barnes & Noble's priority is selling books like Harry Potter and romance novels and backlist books like dictionaries, thesauruses, and Bibles. It is not their primary focus to sell comic books. Now, the other venue where comic books are sold in America these days is your comic book store. And a lot of people would think that your comic book store would be the best place to sell comics. Unfortunately, there are a lot of issues in comic book stores which really impede sales of comic books. And one of the big issues with comic book stores is that it is not a venue that is very customer friendly, especially for a new customer. When you walk into an environment like a comic book store, in many cases, it's just not an inviting environment. And I've been to many comic book stores over the last 25 years, and it's just not a place that would be inviting to a new customer from a business perspective. In many cases, your comic book store is darkly lit. In many cases, your comic book store often has merchandise all over the place, and it's filled with a lot of clutter. It's not filled with a lot of open spaces that customers would feel comfortable walking around in as they went to peruse the shelves for comics and other merchandise, because that's another big problem with comic book stores these days with the clutter is there's a lot of licensed merchandise in addition to comic books being sold there. And primarily, your comic book store is a place where they not only sell comic books, but they also sell video games, action figures, and t-shirts and other items such as statues and model kits and other collectible items related to characters. And one of the big problems with having so much types of merchandise, not only American and imported, in a comic book store is that it's often presented in a way that pretty much, again, creates a lot of clutter and makes people feel uncomfortable. Whenever you go into a comic book store, there's not really much in terms of organization when it comes down to the presentation of merchandise and making it presented in a way that's visually appealing to the customer. When you walk into a comic book store, it's like stuff is all over the place, and it's also stuff from different eras. So something may be popular with collectors may be placed on the same shelf with other stuff. Like you might see a Marvel Legends figure from today with Marvel Legends figures that were unsold from several years ago, and these shop owners just thinking, oh, this is okay, but when the customer looks at this, they're thinking that this is old product and new product together, and it's looking cluttered, and it also looks very sloppy. So it makes the store look like it's not taking care of business, when in actuality, this is just the way the comic shop owner has been running things for years, and this is what's comfortable to comic fans, but it's not comfortable to casual customers. It makes the casual customer look like this store is not taking care of business, and this is what turns a lot of customers away. The other thing that turns customers away at your comic book store in many cases is not just the environment, but the customer service. When it comes down to comic book stores, and primarily their focus is on selling comic books to comic book fans and helping them buy comics, not helping new readers become interested in the characters or the stories, or selling them products and making it forming a relationship with them. In many cases, with these days with the comic shop, they're more focused on the customers who have pull lists with them for the week's comics or the new action figures coming out, rather than focusing on developing relationships with new customers. And new customers are where the real money is in any business. And when it comes down to business in comics, they're not really focused on building that relationship with the new customer. If the new customer were to walk into the comic shop and ask about a character like a Superman or a Batman, they would just be told to go to the section where the comics are, and that's not good customer service. When it comes down to customer service and new customers, you really want to make that customer feel invited. You want them to feel comfortable. And one of the things I used to do when I worked in supermarkets, like Food Emporium back in the 90s, was I would walk all the way to the aisle with the customer, show them the merchandise, and then stay there until the customer pretty much felt comfortable in making their decision. And once they made their decision, they pretty much went on their way. And I did the same thing when I was working at the City College Library. If the customer needed help, I made efforts to try to help the customer if they asked for help. And usually I form good relationships with people doing things like that. And that fostering that relationship with the customer is what's going to build the word of mouth and the reputation for a store. If a store gives a new customer a great shopping experience, they're going to come back and want to buy more products. Unfortunately, most comic shops don't understand how customer service is paramount in building relationships with new customers, because the new customer is walking into this environment and they're feeling extremely uncomfortable. Yes, they love these characters. They've come out of a superhero movie, or they've gotten through watching a Netflix series, and they want to learn more about this character, and they're learning that the only place to find a comic book is a comic shop. But when they come in and they have that experience where they're walking into this dark room filled with lots of clutter, lots of boxes, lots of toys all over the place, they're not feeling like they're in a store that makes them feel comfortable about shopping. Because if you have to step over merchandise or step around merchandise, it's making you feel like this place is not well taken care of. And then you have a bunch of guys clustered in a corner, and again, that's not, and when you ask them for something, they just walk away from you. Again, that's not providing that shopping experience that's going to make that customer a regular customer. And that's one of the big problems with your comic book store. It's a place that's great for comic fans to hang out in, but it's not a business that sells comics to customers who are not comic fans. And with the comic book industry being in a over 25-year slump, you would think that the comic shop would be making more efforts to try to reach new readers and try to rebuild the audience. Unfortunately, that hasn't been done on the comic shop level. The comic shop pretty much has gotten more withdrawn and more insular over the last 25 years, trying to hold on to the older readers without making efforts to reach the new readers. Yes, there are things out here such as Free Comic Book Day. However, Free Comic Book Day really has not had an impact on the business of comics. Yes, you're giving away comics, but in order for the customer to get to the comics, they have to go to a comic book store. And that doesn't really help anything when you look at it from a panoramic perspective, because the customers are alienated by the environment of the comic book store. So giving them a free comic book does not give them an incentive to keep buying comics at the comic book store because they don't like the environment and how it's laid out. They don't like the space with all the clutter. They don't like the darkness. What they want, they're not getting at the comic book store, so they have no incentive to keep buying comic books. And this is a business issue that most comic shop owners really have not thought about, because you can't just have a free comic book day. A good businessman is going to sit there and say that they're going to focus on business 365 days of the year. A free comic is just not going to cut it. What you're going to need to do is focus on a comprehensive plan that brings in new readers all throughout the year. And one of the big problems with the comic book industry overall and comic shops overall is that they do not plan to bring in new readers during the key periods where customers are ready to buy. Yes, they have marketing for these events at the big two comic publishers and many of the smaller comic publishers, but these events often take place in months when casual customers are not spending money. Now, I looked at events like your New 52, which came out in DC Comics. They were launching new comics, and a new universe in August. However, in the publishing world, August is considered a dead month, and that's when they launch books that are considered to be failures. Now, the big periods for selling publications are these two periods. They're the periods of the holiday season, which is from October to about February, which is the big holiday season, which is Halloween, Thanksgiving, and Christmas, which were areas where people are looking for new books to give as gifts and new books to share. And the other big period is the summer reading season, which starts from April to July. Now, those two core periods, most comic publishers aren't paying attention to, because these two core periods are the ones that trade publishers pretty much build their audience of new readers on. When you launch a book in these two core periods, which is October to December or from April to July, you are going to get new readers, because that's when readers have the disposable income to try new titles. And because they have that disposable income to try new titles, they're willing to take a risk on a new book. Unfortunately, most comic publishers don't time the launches of their titles during these key periods in the publishing schedule, and that's why they miss out on sales overall. And then when people have to go to a comic shop to try to find these titles, again, that ties together and prevents the comic from actualizing its potential in the marketplace. Because when we look at the comic shop, it's a venue that really needs to update its approach to business, because again, most comic shops are designed for comic fans, not designed for casual customers. And when your business is in a slump, you have to focus on reestablishing a connection with the casual customer. And the casual customer has walked away after the speculator boom, feeling burned, but there has to be an effort to try to reach that casual customer and get them to come into the comic shop, make it an inviting place, and make it a place that's comfortable especially for the younger readers, such as children. And in many comic shops, they're a hostile environment to young readers. And that's the customer base you really want to try to target, because those younger readers are going to grow up with the product, and they're going to stay with the product for a couple of years. And you really want to get those customers, because when you have a median age that is 40, that's not a good age for a product. When products have a median age of 40 in corporate America, like Oldsmobile and Pontiac had, that's when companies start talking about discontinuing that product, because there's no way for the product to grow any further. And the comic book, as it stands right now, is headed towards that road, because your comic shops, again, don't provide an open environment that allows customers to come in, to try the product, to see the product, and to form good relationships with the customer that leave them with that positive shopping experience that make them excited about buying the product. Now, all of these things tie together, because if you don't have good distribution, which allows people to see the product, and you don't have marketing that gets people excited about the product, then when they come into the shop and they see the environment is a environment that is, again, not conducive to shopping, and then they have to deal with customer service, which really turns them off, where they're told they can't read any comics in the store, they can't look at the merchandise, and there's all of this fear and hostility towards the customer. The customer then says, I don't want to deal with superheroes, I don't want to deal with comic books, I don't want to deal with comics at all. What they want to do is they then walk away just watching the movies and then buying the movie merchandise, and they never learn about how great these characters were in any of the comics and the adventures that they had before. And this is one of the big problems with the comic shop. And the comic shop, again, has to reinvent itself for the 21st century, becoming a brighter environment, a cleaner environment, a more open environment, an environment that is designed to run as a business that sells to customers, not a business that just sells to comic fans. That's all I have to say for this video. You can pick up many of my African American fantasy titles, such as the ISIS series, on Amazon.com, and you can learn more about the comics book industry from my previous videos and my blog, Shawn James Black Freelance Writer. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.